Great, thank you so much. It's great to be here. So I'm going to start and talk for about 4 minutes, and then I'll turn this over to Ron. So as Ann said, our project is called Making the Business Case for Improved Farm Labor Conditions, and this was a collaborative project. And on our last slide, we'll note all of our collaborators. The three principal investigators were myself, Ron Strolik, and Maria Echeveste from the UC Berkeley Law School. And I wanted to acknowledge that we have one of our key collaborators in the audience, Margaret Reeves from the Pesticide Action Network, who was really instrumental in helping get this project off the ground and helping make the connections, the research connections. So we really appreciate her support and for being here today. So I'm just going to go over some of the background quickly. About farm labor conditions in the United States, as many of you probably know, and as Suzanne talked about in her presentation, this is a great segue. Farm workers really characterized by low wages. Most farm workers earn less than $18,000 a year. There's pervasive wage theft, especially with the rise of farm labor contractors. Most farm workers do not work year-round, so there's seasonal unemployment. A lack of benefits. Only about a third of farm workers have health insurance, and many farm workers do not qualify for Obamacare and other federal programs. Dangerous working conditions, as Suzanne talked about, disrespectful treatment, et cetera. There's also, as we talked about in the last presentation, a real fear of speaking up for fear of retaliation, also related to immigration status. So what sort of efforts and approaches have been undertaken to address some of these issues? We kind of characterize these into four groups. Unionization has historically been a strategy. Unfortunately, unionization is down about 90% from the late 1970s at the height of farm worker organizing. Regulation, unfortunately, again, farm workers are excluded from most national labor protections from the National Labor Relations Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act, which has been a real challenge for farm workers. States have enacted some legislation to extend protections to farm workers, but unfortunately, in many cases, these regulations are under-enforced. Community-based organizing is another approach. BFI invited Líderes Campesinas in the past few weeks to campus, and we got to hear about their great work, working with farm worker women in the Central Valley. And then finally, market-based initiatives, which has been the focus of our work, is sort of market and labeling programs to incentivize growers and others to raise the bar on farm labor conditions. So our guiding research questions, basically our big question is, what is the potential for these market-based voluntary certification programs as a mechanism for ensuring meaningful social sustainability in agriculture? And so previous work, so for example, work I did with Sandy Brown, almost 10 years ago, we kind of surveyed the landscape at that point of social certification initiatives, and we found that overall, there was no real broad, meaningful inclusion of farm worker groups in these programs, and often farm workers' concerns were not central to these programs. So kind of addressing this question again 10 years later, we're saying, well, where are we at now? And there are a number of new initiatives that have emerged in the last few years, including the Equitable Food Initiative. And so we asked of the Equitable Food Initiative, is it different? How does it function? What are the impacts for both growers and workers? So what is EFI? EFI is a third-party certification scheme addressing labor, food safety, pest management. It's a partnership of farm worker unions, farm worker advocates, United Farm Workers, a big player, Costco, Bon Appetit Management Company, Pesticide Action Network, Margaret Reeves Group. It's kind of a partner to, all these partners have come together to address these three issues in an integrated way. As of 2 weeks ago, since we made this slide, there are now 20 farms certified in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And I should note, when we started this, looking into this in 2014, there were only 3 farms certified. So have rapid growth, and their goal is they currently impact about 10,000 field workers, and their goal is to affect 100,000 workers by the year 2020. Quickly, Fair Labor Standards, what are it's a very rigorous set of standards. It's a thick document addressing fair compensation, working conditions, et cetera. So the cornerstone of this model is what EFI calls leadership teams. Some of the farms call them collaboration teams. And they're basically, to get EFI certification, every farm has to implement one of these leadership teams on the farm. And the goals of these leadership teams, which are a collaboration between workers and managers, is to establish greater collaboration and channels of communication on the farm, to provide avenues for workers to speak up without fear of retaliation. It's one of the challenges Suzanne mentioned, to provide a vehicle for workers to advocate for themselves, et cetera. And so we spent part of our research looking at these leadership teams. So I'm getting the halfway sign, so I'm going to turn this over to Ron to talk more specifically about our research goals and some of our findings. So
Okay,
thank you,
Christy.
Ron.
Hi, everyone. In terms of the research goals, we were fortunate to get 2 sets of funding for this. So BFI started us off with some seed grant funding to look at the business case issues. And the goal of that really was to develop a set of indicators to look at... Oh, of course. Okay, is that better? Oh, all right. So the goal of the initial research that we were funded for from BFI was to look at what is the business case for improved farm labor conditions. We've done a lot of qualitative work looking at farms, especially talking to a lot of farmers with good, relatively good labor conditions. And we've heard anecdotally that there's lots of different benefits in terms of cost savings, retention, recruitment, training, things like that, especially now. There's a lot of issues around farm labor shortages, so this is a very important issue to be looking at. And then the Packard Foundation invited us to submit a proposal to do some additional work around this. And so again, in consultation with our partners at EFI, we decided to look at the leadership teams model, which is a very kind of innovative worker management model that is common in a lot of other sectors, not in agriculture. This is really one of the very first instances of this type of model in agriculture. So we decided to look at that as well. So just quickly, the key findings from the business case research. Again, the goal was to develop a set of indicators around these issues. We talked to growers, academics, all sorts of other people. And the goal was really to kind of just create a set of indicators that we are now in a subsequent phase going to be testing. So what we came up with were these kind of main indicators that you're seeing here. Retention, again, is a big issue. But people talked about all sorts of other benefits in terms of occupational health and safety, productivity, product quality, food safety. Again, we found that on the EFI farms, people are much more cognizant of food safety. It's a huge issue, of course, for consumers, for growers. Also legal issues and lawsuits. There's much lower likelihood of farm workers suing farms, things like that. In terms of the leadership teams model, this was really interesting. So we spoke with workers, growers, farm managers on 6 different farms in California and Mexico. And in general, the growers were very, very happy with this model. Again, it's a very innovative model. There's these leadership teams of up to about 20 people that include people from the grower or the farm manager down to, the quote-unquote lowest field worker. It's really the first time that field workers said that they were in the same room with growers, being asked their opinions, things like that. The growers are very satisfied with the model in general. It's a great vehicle for two-way information, got a lot of buy-in from the workers. They're able to address issues, kind of again, building on what Suzanne was saying, the opposite is true on EFI farms. Growers want to hear about problems. They want to find ways to improve conditions. It was really, it was a joy to conduct the research. It was great to just kind of be on farms where things are actually working well or better. And again, what was interesting was that the growers and the farm managers said that they would actually continue with this model even if it were not a requirement for certification. Some of the downsides, very high training costs, and a lot of people talked about teaching to the test to pass an audit, which I'm happy to talk about more later on if anyone has questions about that. Workers, very, very happy with the model in general. Again, kind of in contrast to what Suzanne was talking about, workers can advocate for improved conditions without fear of retaliation. This was just incredibly refreshing for people. And again, it was a good thing for the farms as well. Workers suggested improvements that were kind of good for both growers and farm workers. Improved communication, again, more respectful treatment. Some of the indigenous workers said that on other farms they had been discriminated against, and on these farms, nobody called them Oaxaquita, which is kind of a demeaning term for indigenous people. Women also talked about virtually no sexual harassment, again, very, very different from most farms. Some of our concerns is that the workers are supposed to be the eyes and ears on the ground to monitor the implementation of the standards. People have a general sense of the standards. They don't really have a clear sense of the specific standards. So, it's a hard thing. As Christy mentioned, there's, these many standards, but that's just something that needs to kind of be looked at. Again, we found the role of women. The standards require that women and indigenous workers and contract workers be on the leadership teams, and it sounds like that is happening to some extent, maybe not as fully as we would like. And again, there's issues around women being reluctant to speak up. And very steep learning curve So just in terms of conclusions and next steps, so we're definitely seeing that EFI as a label has very strong participation from farm worker organizations and other organizations. And we're seeing a lot of kind of positive changes on the farms. But again, it's important to caution that this is a market-based, it's a voluntary certification system. Growers can adopt it if they want. They don't have to adopt it if they don't want to. They can leave it at any time. And so, ultimately, it's important to not see this as a panacea, given the current environment. It seems like a promising approach, but again, it's not a substitute for collective bargaining, and it's not a substitute for more stringent regulations and enforcement. And then we'll just make a plug for the BFI podcast, Just Food, that was just released, and maybe after we finish up, somebody can talk more about that. And we have a funding proposal in right now to do some next steps looking at the indicators that we would like to pilot on 2 or 3 farms that are seeking EFI certification. So we'd like to do baseline, looking at issues around retention, product quality, things like that, and then follow up and see, do these things really change? It really will be the first time that this type of thing has been kind of quantitatively assessed in agriculture, so we're excited about that. We're also going to be doing, thanks again to BFI for additional funding, some research looking at the social certification landscape in general. In the U.S., we're seeing more actors coming on board trying to certify farms on fair labor conditions. So we're looking forward to doing that as well. And I think that's it. Yep. And again, thanks so much to all our collaborators. Thank you. I hope I wasn't talking too fast.
Thank you so much, Christy and Ron. And we do have time for a few questions. And then we'll...
Do you want to make a plug for the podcast?
Well, I actually was going to do that after, but
Oh,
go
okay.
ahead and do it. No, I'll do it now. Yes, so we're really excited that we just launched, the Berkeley Food Institute just launched our first podcast episode. We're doing a series on people and places behind the food system. So you'll see more of that coming out soon. But the first episode was on the Equitable Food Initiative, and it involved interviews with farm workers. And I want to give a shout out to our communications specialist, Louisa Brown, who took a lead on coordinating that project. We worked with the journalism school and some really cool reporters, and it was a really interesting project. So if you have a chance to check it out, it's on our website. And look for more of those in the future. We'd love to get feedback too. So if you have any comments, we're going to be continuing to do these, featuring research and work going on our campus and beyond. So if you have some ideas, also let us know. I also just want to thank Louisa for this, and Julia, our communications assistant, for this terrific, nice brochure or collection of all these research findings. So questions for Ron and Christy?
We'll ask each other. I'm curious, just with what you mentioned about the workers having a general sense of labor standards, is there another, or what's the other check, I guess, to see how the farms are, sort of comparing what the workers are finding? Is there, for example, a voluntary Cal/OSHA inspection to look at occupational health and whether things are being followed? Sort of the accuracy of, and being able to then give feedback to the workers based on those findings.
Go ahead.
Right. Sure. So the other piece of it that we didn't talk about is that there is an audit process. And Margaret, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I wonder if you might be able to talk a little bit about how the audit process works on the EFI farms?
Sure, yeah. Every EFI farm, I'm Margaret Reeves, up there mentioned.
And Margaret is on the EFI board, too.
Every EFI farm is audited by a third-party auditor, and in order to get certification, and then there are periodic audits again. If there's any violation identified by a worker or anybody else on the farm, then the certification body can be called in for an emergency audit if that's necessary.
And who are the auditors?
Right now, it's UL and SES are the 2 main auditors, both accredited by ANSI. There could be others. There's a EFI-specific auditor training that goes on because this audit requires the auditors to understand both social, food safety, pesticide. You got to have auditors who are actually trained in all 3 of those. SCS is
Scientific Certification Systems and Underwriter Laboratories.
That's right. Thank you.
And I will say that one of the very innovative things about the EFI model is that as opposed to most social certifications, the model is that there's standards that the farm has to comply with. An auditor comes in once a year, once every 2 years, speaks to people, gets information, writes a report. Oftentimes what we found is that farm workers especially are reluctant to be honest with the auditors. They don't know them. It's kind of like what Suzanne was saying about the issues around mistrust. This is true across the board. It's I think it's especially an issue for indigenous workers, but it's true for all farm workers. And so a lot of times it's not really clear if the audit is picking up on real problems. The auditor might come in, ask the workers, how's it go? And the workers are like, oh, sure, everything's great. Who is this guy? And are they going to talk to the grower after this? The nice thing about the EFI model is that the workers are actually empowered to be the eyes and ears of the standards. And so if they see any issues around noncompliance, they are tasked with actually reporting that. And again, it's in the best interest of the grower as well, because they don't want to lose their certification. And the workers know that the certification is good for the farm. It means more work for them. It means more money for them. So it's a really interesting kind of a win-win, if you will, type of a model.
I think in the interest of time, we'll move on, but thank you so